welcome back to Divine Sleep Whisper. Close your eyes, let go of the day, and take a deep, slow breath in and let it out. You are safe here. Tonight, the outside world can wait. Tonight, I invite you to step away from the endless rush, the schedules, and the noise. We are journeying to a quiet, forgotten garden behind an old stone church, a sanctuary where time moves beautifully slow. If these stories bring comfort to your nights, please take a soft moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps this peaceful sanctuary grow and ensures you never miss a night of rest. Now, settle deeply into your bed. Let your breathing find its natural, peaceful rhythm and allow yourself to drift away into tonight's story. Tonight, I want to tell you a story about a man named Thomas. For 15 years, Thomas arrived at the same place before sunrise. Not because anyone asked him to, not because it was his job, and certainly not because anyone was paying him. He simply came. Every single morning, at 6 o'clock, while most of the town was still asleep, Thomas would unlock a small wooden gate behind an old church and step into a garden that very few people ever noticed. The church itself wasn't famous. It sat quietly on the edge of town beside a narrow road lined with maple trees. People drove past it every day without giving it much thought. And if they happened to glance toward the back of the property, they would see nothing more than a modest garden hidden behind a stone wall. But Thomas loved that garden. Not because it was beautiful. At least not at first. Years earlier, it had been almost forgotten. The flower beds were overgrown. The pathways were cracked. Weeds seemed to grow faster than anything else. Most people assumed the garden's best days were behind it. Thomas saw something different. He saw potential. And perhaps that was because he understood what it felt like to be overlooked. The truth was, Thomas hadn't always been a gardener. For most of his life, he worked as a carpenter. He built houses, repaired roofs, installed doors, created things with his hands. He enjoyed the work. He enjoyed the people. And for many years, life followed a predictable rhythm. Then one difficult season changed everything. His wife passed away after a long illness. And suddenly, the life he had known for decades felt unfamiliar. The house felt quieter. The days felt longer. Even ordinary things seemed different. Grief is a way of doing that. It changes the shape of everyday life. The same rooms feel different. The same streets feel different. Even the same sunrise can look different. For a long time, Thomas didn't know what to do with all the empty hours. Friends encouraged him to stay busy. Family checked on him often. Everyone meant well. But some burdens cannot be carried by other people. Some journeys must be walked one step at a time. One afternoon, while taking a walk through town, Thomas wandered behind the church. He wasn't looking for anything, at least not intentionally. Sometimes people discover important places that way. That was when he found the garden. Or perhaps, the garden found him. The place was neglected, quiet, forgotten. Yet something about it made him stop walking. Maybe it was the old apple tree standing in the center. Maybe it was the silence. Or maybe it was because the garden looked exactly the way he felt at the time. Tired, unattended, waiting for something. The next day he returned. Then the day after that. Then again the following week. At first, he simply sat on a weathered bench beneath the apple tree. Some mornings he stayed 10 minutes, other mornings an hour. He didn't always think. He didn't always pray. Sometimes he simply sat there listening to birds move through the branches overhead. Then one morning, he noticed weeds covering a flower bed near the church wall. Without really planning to, he pulled a few of them out. Just a few. Nothing significant. The following morning he returned with gardening gloves. A week later he brought a shovel. A month later he was planting flowers. And before long, the forgotten garden had become part of his daily life. What began as a small project slowly became something more. Not because the garden needed saving, but because Thomas did. And over the years, as flowers returned to the pathways, something else quietly returned as well. Hope, purpose, peace. Most people never knew that story. They simply saw an older man caring for flowers. They didn't know how much those flowers had cared for him first. And that brings us to a cool spring morning many years later. The garden was thriving. The apple tree stood tall. Bright flowers lined the pathways. Birdsong filled the air. And Thomas was kneeling beside a flower bed just after sunrise, when he heard the gate open behind him. At first, he didn't look up. Visitors occasionally wandered into the garden. Most stayed only a few minutes before leaving. But something about these footsteps felt different. They were slower, heavier somehow, as if the person walking through the gate was carrying more than a backpack, as if they were carrying a burden. Thomas stood up and brushed the soil from his hands. Then he turned around. A young man stood near the entrance to the garden, perhaps 25 years old. Tired eyes, wrinkled clothes, and an expression that suggested he hadn't slept well in quite some time. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The young man looked around at the flowers, at the pathways, at the old apple tree, almost as if he wasn't sure why he had come, or what he was looking for. Then finally he asked a question. A simple question, but one that would begin a conversation neither of them would ever forget. "Do you mind if I sit here for a while?" For a moment, Thomas simply looked at him. Not in suspicion, not in judgment, just curiosity. The young man stood near the gate with both hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. He looked exhausted, not the kind of tiredness that comes from missing a night's sleep. Something deeper than that. The kind of weariness people carry when their minds have been running for too long. Thomas smiled gently. Of course. He gestured toward the bench beneath the apple tree. "That's what it's there for." The young man nodded. "Thank you." Then he walked slowly across the garden and sat down. For a while, nothing happened. Thomas returned to his flowers. The young man sat quietly on the bench. Birds moved through the branches overhead. A breeze stirred the leaves. The town beyond the church slowly began waking up, and neither man seemed interested in interrupting the silence. After nearly 10 minutes, the young man finally spoke. Not loudly, almost as if he were speaking more to himself than to anyone else. "I didn't know this place existed." Thomas chuckled. "Most people don't." The young man looked around. "I've lived here for 3 years. That's longer than some of the flowers. A faint smile appeared on the young man's face. The first one Thomas had seen. It disappeared quickly. But it was there. And sometimes, small things matter. The young man leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. I've driven past this church hundreds of times. His eyes followed a bee moving between flowers. And somehow I never noticed the garden. Thomas nodded. It happens. The young man was quiet again. Then he asked, "Do you take care of all of this by yourself?" Thomas looked around at the flower beds, the pathways, the apple tree, and the rows of lavender swaying gently in the morning breeze. Mostly. That seems like a lot of work. It is. The young man looked surprised. Then why do it? Thomas smiled. Not because he had a clever answer, but because it was a question people asked often, and the answer was never quite the same. He set down his gardening trowel, straightened up, and looked toward the apple tree. Have you ever planted anything? The young man shook his head. No. Thomas nodded. Then let me tell you something. He pointed toward a row of small plants growing near the stone wall. When people plant a seed, nothing seems to happen at first. The young man followed his gaze. There are days when the soil looks exactly the same. A week passes. Still nothing. Sometimes 2 weeks. Still nothing. The garden remained quiet around them as birds sang softly from somewhere above. And if someone didn't know better, Thomas continued, they might assume the seed isn't growing. The young man nodded. Seems reasonable. It does, Thomas smiled. But underneath the surface, he gently tapped the soil with his glove. A great deal is happening. Roots are forming. Strength is developing. Growth is happening where nobody can see it. The young man stared toward the flower bed, listening carefully now. Thomas looked back toward him. A lot of people are like that too. The words settled quietly between them. No pressure. No lecture. Just an observation. For the first time, the young man's expression changed. Only slightly, but enough to suggest the words had landed somewhere important. He looked down at the ground, then asked, "What if you've been waiting a long time?" Thomas considered the question. The way it was asked made him think the young man wasn't talking about flowers anymore. "What are you waiting for?" The young man laughed softly, but there wasn't much humor in it. That's part of the problem. He stared toward the church wall. I'm not even sure anymore. The answer hung in the air. Honest. Unexpected. Human. Thomas had heard many answers over the years. People often knew exactly what they wanted, a promotion, a relationship, more money. But sometimes, the hardest seasons in life are the ones where a person no longer knows what they're searching for. The young man rubbed his hands together, as though trying to warm them, though the morning wasn't cold. I thought by now I'd have things figured out. Thomas smiled. Most people think that. The young man looked toward him. When does that happen? When does what happen? When do people figure everything out? Thomas laughed. A real laugh this time, the kind that comes from experience. The young man couldn't help smiling. What? Ethan asked. Thomas shook his head. I've met people in their 20s who thought they had everything figured out. He picked up his trowel again. I've met people in their 70s who were still learning. He gently loosened the soil around another plant. The truth is, his voice softened. Life isn't something you figure out all at once. The breeze moved through the apple tree. A few blossoms drifted slowly to the ground. The young man watched them fall. Then what is it? Thomas thought for a moment. A longer moment than most people would have taken, because some questions deserve patience. Finally he answered, I think life is something you learn to notice. The young man frowned slightly. What does that mean? Thomas looked around the garden, at the flowers, the tree, the birds, the sunlight beginning to spill across the pathways. It means most of the important things happen quietly. His voice remained calm. Friendship, trust, healing, growth. The young man listened. The garden seemed even quieter now, as though it too were listening. You usually don't notice those things while they're happening, Thomas continued. You only realize later how much they changed you. The young man stared toward the apple tree, thinking, not arguing, just thinking. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The conversation had only just begun, yet somehow the garden already felt different, as though something important had stepped through the gate that morning along with the stranger. And neither of them knew yet that this simple conversation would continue far beyond a single sunrise. For several minutes, the garden returned to silence. Not an uncomfortable silence, but the kind that often appears when a person hears something they need time to think about. Thomas continued working among the flowers. The young man remained on the bench beneath the apple tree, watching, thinking, listening to the sounds around him, the rustle of leaves, the distant chirping of birds, the gentle scrape of a gardening tool moving through soil. It was strange. He couldn't remember the last time he had sat somewhere without reaching for his phone, without checking a message, without feeling the need to do something. Yet here, he found himself simply being still. And somehow, that felt unfamiliar. Eventually, Thomas broke the silence. What's your name? The young man looked up. Ethan. Thomas nodded. Nice to meet you, Ethan. You too. Then silence returned once more, but this time it felt easier, as though introductions had removed some invisible barrier between them. A few minutes later, Thomas walked over carrying a small watering can. He stopped beside a flower bed near the bench, carefully watering a row of young plants. Ethan watched for a moment, then asked, Can I ask you something? Of course. Ethan hesitated. Not because the question was complicated, but because it felt personal, even to him. Do people come here often? Thomas smiled. Sometimes. Why? The older man looked around the garden, as though considering the question seriously. Different reasons. Some people come because they're lonely. Some come because they're tired. Some come because they're grieving. Some come because they need a quiet place to think. Ethan nodded slowly. That made sense. The garden felt like the kind of place people found when they were searching for something, even if they weren't sure what that something was. Thomas glanced toward him. And sometimes people come here because they've been carrying something for too long. The words were gentle, yet direct. Ethan looked away, toward the flowers, toward the church wall, toward anything except Thomas, because he knew exactly what the older man meant. For months now, it felt as though he had been carrying a weight he couldn't explain, a pressure he couldn't name. Nothing dramatic had happened. That was the strange part. His health was fine. He had a job, an apartment, friends, and family. From the outside, everything looked normal, maybe even successful. Yet every morning, he woke up feeling exhausted. Not physically, but emotionally. As though life had become a list of responsibilities he kept completing without understanding why. Work, bills, appointments, sleep, repeat. Week after week, month after month. The days weren't bad, they simply felt empty. And somehow, that felt even harder to explain. Because people understand sadness, failure, and loss, but they don't always understand emptiness. Ethan stared at the ground. I don't know what's wrong with me. The words escaped before he could stop them. Thomas didn't answer immediately. He set down the watering can, then sat on the opposite end of the bench, not too close, not too far. You know, he said quietly, that's a sentence I've heard many times. Ethan looked toward him as Thomas smiled gently. And most of the people who said it were asking the wrong question. Ethan frowned. What do you mean? The older man rested his hands on his knees. The question isn't always what's wrong with me. He paused. Sometimes the question is, what has been missing? The words settled softly between them. Ethan didn't respond, but something about the question felt different. Less harsh, less accusing. For months he had treated himself like a problem that needed solving, something broken and defective. Yet Thomas wasn't talking about brokenness, he was talking about absence, as though perhaps an important part of life had quietly slipped away. The breeze moved through the apple tree overhead. Sunlight filtered between the branches. The garden remained peaceful, patient, and unhurried. Thomas pointed toward a patch of flowers nearby, where bright yellow blossoms swayed gently in the morning light. See those? Ethan nodded. Last year they barely grew. What happened? Thomas smiled. I kept checking the soil. The older man leaned back slightly. Everything seemed fine. Good sunlight. Good water. No disease. So why weren't they growing? Thomas looked toward the flowers, then back at Ethan. Because a larger tree nearby had slowly expanded its roots underground. The flowers weren't dying, they simply weren't receiving what they needed anymore. The breeze carried the scent of lavender across the garden, soft and calming. So what did you do? Ethan asked. Thomas smiled. I moved them. Ethan laughed quietly. That's it? That's it, the old gardener chuckled. Sometimes solutions are simpler than people expect. Then his expression softened. Not easy, but simple. Ethan looked down at his hands, thinking again. Because lately, he had spent so much time asking what was wrong, he had never stopped to ask what was missing. Maybe he was missing rest. Maybe purpose. Maybe meaningful relationships, or time away from screens. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't trying to force an answer. He was simply considering the possibility, and somehow that felt like progress. The morning sun climbed higher above the garden. Birds continued singing, flowers swayed gently in the breeze, and beneath the old apple tree, two people sat quietly together. One asking questions, the other helping him discover better ones. Because sometimes, the beginning of healing isn't finding an answer, it's finding the right question. For a while, neither of them said anything. The conversation seemed to settle gently into the garden around them, like sunlight settling across the flowers. No rush. No pressure. Just space. Ethan watched a butterfly drift lazily between two flower beds. Its path seemed random and unplanned, yet somehow it always found where it needed to go. "Can I tell you something?" he asked quietly. Thomas nodded. "Of course." Ethan looked down at his hands before speaking, as though the words might be easier to find there. "I used to have plans. When I was younger, I thought life would feel different by now." The sentence hung in the air, simple, honest, and painfully human. Thomas didn't interrupt. He had learned long ago that people often hear themselves more clearly when nobody rushes to answer. "I thought there would be a moment when everything finally made sense." Ethan laughed softly, a tired laugh. Like I had reached some invisible finish line. The garden remained quiet around them. "And?" Thomas asked gently. Ethan shook his head. "I reached some of the goals." He stared toward the church wall. "I got the job I wanted. I moved into my own place. I achieved things I used to dream about." The breeze stirred the branches overhead as a few apple blossoms drifted toward the ground, slowly and gracefully. But after a while, I realized every goal felt exactly the same. Thomas listened as the younger man's voice continued, not bitter, just confused. "I'd worked towards something for months, sometimes years. Then I'd reach it," he shrugged, "and 2 weeks later I'd be chasing something else." Thomas nodded slowly, as though he'd heard that story many times before. Ethan stared at the flowers. "I kept thinking happiness was waiting somewhere ahead. Just one more achievement. One more promotion. One more accomplishment." The old gardener smiled gently. "And how far ahead did happiness stay?" A small laugh escaped Ethan. "Exactly one step further." Both men smiled. There was something strangely comforting about saying it out loud. Not because it solved anything, but because it made the burden feel less lonely. Thomas leaned back slightly on the bench, his eyes drifting toward the apple tree, toward branches that had stood through countless seasons. "Do you know something interesting about trees?" Ethan looked over. "What?" Thomas pointed upward. "Every spring people admire the blossoms. In summer they admire the shade. In autumn they admire the colors. And in winter?" Ethan asked. Thomas smiled. "In winter people assume nothing is happening." The younger man followed his gaze as the branches swayed gently overhead. "But winter is when many of the important things happen." Thomas's voice softened. "The tree rests. It conserves strength. It prepares for another season." Ethan listened carefully, because somehow he knew this conversation wasn't really about trees anymore. "You think I'm in winter?" he asked quietly. Thomas chuckled. "I think people spend too much time judging their seasons." Ethan laughed at the unexpected answer. The old gardener smiled. "Everyone wants to be in spring. Everyone wants growth, progress, and visible results. But life doesn't work that way. Every season serves a purpose." The words were simple, yet they carried the heavy weight of experience. Ethan looked around at the flowers, the pathways, the old apple tree, and the man sitting beside him. For the first time since arriving, he noticed something. Thomas never seemed rushed. Not once, not during the conversation, not while gardening, not while answering questions. And suddenly Ethan became curious. "Can I ask you something?" Thomas nodded. "Another question?" "Probably." Both of them smiled. Ethan hesitated briefly, then asked, "When was the last time you were worried about the future?" The question caught Thomas off guard, making him think. The old gardener looked out across the garden, toward the gate, toward the church, and toward the morning sky above, remembering. Finally he smiled. "A few days ago." Ethan blinked. "A few days ago?" Thomas laughed. "Of course." The younger man looked genuinely surprised. "I thought people eventually outgrew that." The old gardener shook his head, his smile remaining warm. "No. You simply learn not to invite every worry into your house." The sentence made Ethan pause. Thomas continued, "Imagine someone knocks on your front door." The breeze moved softly through the garden. "You don't have to let every visitor stay for dinner." A laugh escaped Ethan as he stared toward the flowers, really thinking about that. Because lately, he had welcomed every worry, fear, and worst-case scenario, giving them comfortable seats and feeding them attention, allowing them to stay far longer than they deserved. And perhaps that was exhausting too. The morning continued unfolding around them as the sun climbed higher and the shadows shortened. Somewhere beyond the church walls, the rest of the town rushed through another ordinary day, but beneath the old apple tree, something quieter was happening. A conversation, a friendship beginning, and a young man slowly discovering that wisdom chess pieces rarely arrive as a grand revelation. More often, it arrives as a series of small truths, spoken gently, heard at the right time, and remembered long after the conversation ends. The morning sun continued rising, spilling light across the garden paths. The flowers seemed brighter now and the air a little warmer, yet neither Thomas nor Ethan seemed eager to leave. Some conversations create that feeling, the feeling that there is no schedule more important than the moment you're already in. Ethan looked around the garden again, this time more carefully, noticing details he had overlooked earlier, the stone pathway winding between flower beds, the birdhouse attached to the apple tree, and the wooden bench beneath him. Then something caught his attention, a small metal handle beneath the edge of the bench, almost hidden, almost invisible. He frowned slightly. "What is that?" Thomas followed his gaze, then smiled as a quiet chuckle escaped him. "Oh, you found it." Ethan knelt beside the bench and pulled gently on the handle. A small wooden compartment slid open beneath the seat, and inside rested a single notebook, its cover worn from years of use and its corners softened by time. Ethan looked surprised. "You keep a notebook under the bench?" Thomas nodded. "For a long time now." "What is it?" The old gardener smiled. "Open it." Carefully, Ethan lifted the notebook. The pages were filled with different handwriting, different dates, and different people. Some entries were short, only a sentence or two, while others filled entire pages, but every entry seemed personal, honest, and real. Ethan turned to one of the first pages. The handwriting was shaky, likely written years ago. He read quietly. "Today was the first day I laughed since losing my husband. I didn't expect it to happen in a garden." He turned another page. "I came here looking for answers. I left with better questions." And another. "The flowers didn't fix my problems, but they reminded me life still grows." Ethan looked up. "What is all this?" Thomas rested his hands on his knees. "A record." "A record of what?" The old gardener smiled toward the flowers. "People. For years, people have sat on this bench. Some stayed 10 minutes, some stayed hours. Some came once, some came every week. The garden seemed quieter now, as though even the birds were listening. And every so often, Thomas said, someone would ask if they could leave a note behind. Ethan looked down at the notebook. The pages suddenly felt heavy with the emotional pieces of people's lives that they had chosen to leave here. Why? He asked quietly. Thomas thought for a moment, then smiled. Because sometimes people need proof. Proof of what? That they're not the first person to struggle. The answer settled gently between them. Ethan stared at the notebook, and suddenly he understood. Every page represented someone who had once felt lost, someone who had once carried questions and sat exactly where he was sitting now. And somehow, that felt comforting. Not because their stories were identical, but because they were human. For months, Ethan had felt isolated inside his own thoughts, as though everyone else had life figured out and he was the only person quietly questioning things. The notebook suggested otherwise. It reminded him that uncertainty, confusion, and doubt were not unusual, they were simply part of being human. He turned the pages, each entry different, yet connected by a shared honesty. One note simply said, "Life became lighter when I stopped demanding certainty from every tomorrow." Another read, "I spent years waiting for a better chapter. Then I realized I was skipping the one I was already living." Ethan smiled faintly. The words felt familiar, not because he had heard them before, but because he needed them now. Thomas watched quietly, allowing the notebook to do what it had done for many years, speak when words from another person weren't necessary. Finally, Ethan closed it carefully and respectfully, as though returning something valuable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The garden seemed content to hold the silence. Then Ethan asked, "Did you write any of these?" Thomas smiled. "A few." "A few?" The old gardener laughed. "Most belong to other people." Ethan nodded slowly, then glanced down at the notebook one more time as a quiet thought began forming in his mind. Perhaps one day, he would leave a note too, not today, not yet, but maybe someday when he understood his own story a little better. The old gardener stood slowly, his knees protesting slightly. Ethan couldn't help smiling, and Thomas noticed. "Wait until you're my age," he said, and both of them laughed. The garden felt different now, less like a place, and more like a collection of lives that had briefly crossed paths, each carrying something, learning something, and growing in ways they often couldn't see at the time. And somewhere deep inside, Ethan realized he wasn't just visiting the garden anymore, he was becoming part of its story. For a while, Thomas returned to his work while Ethan remained on the bench, the notebook resting closed beside him but still occupying his thoughts. It was strange. He had spent months trying to find answers online, reading articles and watching videos from people he had never met. Yet a few handwritten pages inside an old notebook had somehow felt more helpful and honest, perhaps because nobody in those pages was pretending to have a perfect life or offering shortcuts. Just ordinary people being truthful. And truth has a way of making people feel less alone. The garden continued moving through its morning rhythm. A bird landed briefly on the stone wall, a squirrel darted beneath a hedge, and the breeze carried the scent of roses from somewhere nearby. Eventually Ethan stood from the bench, stretched, looked around, and then walked slowly toward one of the flower beds where Thomas was working. Without saying anything, he knelt beside him. Thomas glanced over, slightly amused. "Can I help?" The old gardener smiled. "Depends. On what?" Have you ever planted anything before? Ethan laughed. You already know the answer to that. Thomas chuckled. Fair point. The older man handed him a small gardening trowel. Then today seems like a good day to start. Ethan looked down at the tool, then at the flowers, then back at Thomas. That's your solution? Thomas grinned. No, it's just gardening. For the first time that morning, Ethan laughed fully, the kind of laugh that arrives unexpectedly and feels good. And together they began working, not talking much, just loosening soil, pulling weeds, and planting new flowers. At first, Ethan felt awkward and unsure of what he was doing, concerned he might do something wrong. But Thomas never corrected every mistake, never hovered, and never turned it into a lesson. He simply let Ethan learn by doing. After 20 minutes, something surprising happened. Ethan stopped thinking about himself. He stopped thinking about work, the future, or replaying old worries. His attention shifted entirely to the soil, the flowers, and the task in front of him, and for those few moments, his mind finally grew quiet. Not permanently, but briefly. And sometimes brief peace is enough to remind a person what peace feels like. Thomas seemed to notice, though he didn't mention it. Instead, he pointed toward a patch of lavender. Those were almost dead 3 summers ago. Ethan looked surprised. Really? Thomas nodded. Completely dried out. What happened? The old gardener smiled. They recovered. How? Thomas shrugged. Water. Patience. A little time. The answer sounded almost disappointingly simple, yet the more Ethan thought about it, the more wisdom it contained. Most things in nature didn't recover overnight. Trees didn't, flowers didn't, and gardens didn't. Maybe people didn't either. The thought settled quietly inside him. A church bell rang somewhere nearby, its sound drifting softly across the morning air before fading away. Ethan looked toward the church, then back toward the flowers, and finally toward Thomas. A question had been forming in his mind for some time now. Why do you stay? This garden, the town, the routine. Thomas looked up. What do you mean? Ethan gestured around them. The older man leaned back slightly, thinking, because the question deserved a real answer. Finally, he smiled. I stay because I've learned something. The breeze moved softly through the apple tree overhead as Ethan waited. Thomas looked around the garden, at the flowers, the pathways, the bench, and the notebook hidden beneath it. Then quietly he said, most people spend their lives searching for meaning. They assume meaning is hiding somewhere far away, another city, another job, another season of life. But sometimes, meaning grows exactly where you've been standing all along. The words lingered because they felt entirely true. For a moment, Ethan looked around the garden again and really looked at the flowers, the sunlight, the old apple tree, and the man beside him. Nothing extraordinary or impressive, yet somehow it felt important. And perhaps that was the lesson. Not everything meaningful announces itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like a flower blooming, a conversation beginning, or an ordinary morning in a garden behind a church. The two of them continued working side by side as the sun climbed higher overhead. And without realizing it, Ethan was already carrying something different than when he first walked through the gate. Not answers or certainty, but something better, a little hope. And sometimes, hope is where every new chapter begins. The morning slowly turned into afternoon. Sunlight stretched across the garden and the shadows beneath the apple tree shifted. Before Ethan realized it, several hours had passed. It surprised him, since normally he checked the time constantly for meetings, schedules, and deadlines. Yet here, he had forgotten to look at his watch even once. There was something refreshing about that, not because responsibilities didn't matter, but because for a little while, they weren't demanding his attention. As the afternoon light softened, Ethan finally stood. "I should probably go." Thomas nodded. "Probably." Neither of them moved immediately. The strange thing about meaningful places is that leaving them can feel harder than arriving. Ethan glanced toward the bench, toward the notebook hidden beneath it, and toward the flowers they had planted together, then back at Thomas. "Will you be here tomorrow?" The old gardener smiled. "Where else would I be?" Both of them laughed, and for the first time in months, Ethan found himself looking forward to tomorrow, simply because he wanted to come back. The next morning, Ethan returned. And the morning after that, then again several days later. Sometimes he stayed for 10 minutes, sometimes an hour, occasionally much longer. There was no formal arrangement or expectation. The garden simply became a place he visited, a place where life seemed easier to understand. Weeks passed, then months. Spring slowly gave way to summer. The flowers grew taller, the trees fuller, and the days warmer. Little by little, changes began happening in Ethan's life, the kind that rarely make headlines. He started taking evening walks again, spent less time staring at screens, and more time calling old friends and noticing simple things, a sunset, a conversation, a quiet meal, or a good book. The strange part was that his circumstances hadn't changed very much. He still worked the same job and lived in the same apartment, yet somehow, life felt different because he was different. One evening near the end of summer, Ethan arrived at the garden just before sunset. The sky glowed orange above the church steeple and the air carried that familiar scent of warm earth. But something felt unusual. Thomas wasn't working. Instead, the old gardener sat quietly on the bench beneath the apple tree looking toward the sunset, his hands resting still and thoughtful in his lap. Ethan walked over. "You okay?" Thomas smiled. "Of course." But there was something deeply reflective in his expression. The younger man sat beside him, and for a while, they watched the evening sky together without speaking. Eventually, Thomas pointed toward the apple tree. "Do you know how long that tree has been here?" Ethan shook his head. "No idea." The old gardener smiled. "Neither do I." Both of them laughed, then his expression softened. "But I know something else." "What?" Thomas looked up to the branches. "I won't always be sitting beneath it." The words arrived gently, without sadness or fear. Simply truth. Ethan became quiet because suddenly he understood what Thomas was saying. The old gardener had spent years caring for this place, planting seeds he might never see fully bloom, and one day, someone else would continue the work. That was the way of gardens, and that was the way of life. Thomas smiled toward the flower beds. "You know, people think gardeners grow flowers." Ethan looked over as the old man chuckled. "We do. But that's not the most important thing. The most important thing gardeners grow is faith." Ethan frowned slightly. "Faith?" The old gardener nodded. "Every seed planted is an act of faith. You place something small into the ground, you care for it, you wait, and you trust that growth is happening even when you can't see it. It turns out, life asks the same thing from people." The garden grew quiet around them as the sun drifted lower beyond the trees. Beneath the old apple tree, Ethan realized that perhaps the garden had never been about flowers at all. Perhaps it had always been about learning to trust growth before it becomes visible, learning to be patient with seasons, and learning to notice what truly matters. Summer slowly faded into autumn. Gold and amber began appearing among the trees, and the air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves. Still, Ethan continued visiting the garden. The conversations continued too, some long, some short, and some mornings they barely spoke at all, yet both experiences seemed equally valuable. One crisp autumn morning, Ethan walked through the gate carrying 2 cups of coffee, a habit he had started several weeks earlier. The garden was quiet, leaves covered parts of the pathway, and the bench beneath the tree was empty. Ethan looked around toward the flower beds and the greenhouse, but there was no sign of Thomas. For a moment, a small feeling of concern appeared, because after all these months, the old gardener was always there first. Then Ethan noticed an envelope resting on the bench with his name written neatly across the front, Ethan. Slowly, he sat down, placed the coffee cups beside him, and opened the envelope to find a folded letter written in Thomas's familiar handwriting. If you're reading this, I'm probably spending the morning exactly where I've been meaning to spend more mornings lately. Before you become concerned, I'm perfectly fine. But there's something I've wanted to tell you for a long time. When you first walked through the gate, you thought you came looking for answers. Most people do. What they usually discover is something different. The garden never existed to give people answers. Gardens are far too honest for that. Instead, they teach patience, trust, and how to notice growth. Many years ago, after losing someone I loved deeply, I came to this garden believing my life had stopped. I thought healing meant becoming the person I had been before. I was wrong. Healing never took me backward, it carried me forward, not into the same life, but into a different one. People often ask when life finally becomes clear. The truth is, it rarely does, and that's okay. Clarity isn't what carries people forward, faith does, the willingness to take the next step even when the entire path is invisible. One day, someone will walk through this gate carrying a burden you cannot see. When that day comes, offer them the same gift someone once offered you, your attention, your patience, and your kindness. Most people don't need perfect advice, they simply need someone willing to sit beside them beneath the apple tree. The flowers were never the point. The people were. For a long moment, Ethan sat quietly on the bench, the letter resting in his lap as the autumn garden glowed softly around him. And suddenly, he understood enough to keep moving forward, enough to appreciate the season he was in, and enough to trust that growth was happening even when he couldn't see it. A sound came from the garden gate, the soft creak of hinges opening. Ethan looked up as a young woman stepped inside, pausing and looking around uncertainly. The expression on her face looked intensely familiar, tired, thoughtful, and searching. For a brief moment, Ethan almost smiled because he remembered another morning, another visitor, and another person carrying questions. Slowly, he folded Thomas's letter, placed it back inside the envelope, and set it beside him on the bench. Then he looked toward the young woman, and with a gentle smile, he spoke the same words that had changed everything for him. "Would you like to sit here for a while?" The autumn breeze moved through the garden, the leaves rustled softly overhead, and inside the stone walls, a new story was just beginning. Sometimes the most important growth in life happens where nobody can see it, like roots beneath the soil, healing within the heart, or faith growing quietly through ordinary days. The world often teaches people to chase bigger goals and destinations, yet many of life's greatest gifts arrive quietly. A conversation, a friendship, a moment of kindness, or a peaceful morning where someone feels understood. Perhaps tonight, there is something in this story that feels familiar. Not because you have spent time in a garden behind a church, but because everyone knows what it feels like to be waiting for growth they cannot yet see. There are seasons when progress feels obvious, and then there are quieter seasons where very little appears to change and questions remain unanswered. Yet nature teaches us that growth is often invisible before it becomes visible. Roots form long before flowers appear, and many of life's most important changes begin quietly beneath the surface. Perhaps there is something in your own life that is growing right now, a new strength, a deeper patience, a wiser perspective, or a healing that is still unfolding. Gardens do not bloom overnight, and neither do people. Meaningful things require time, not because time magically solves everything, but because some things simply cannot be rushed. Trust, wisdom, healing, and growth cannot be rushed. And tonight, there is comfort in remembering that. You do not need to have every answer before tomorrow arrives, nor do you need to understand every chapter before turning the page. Sometimes the next small step is enough. Quiet faith is enough. Simply continuing forward is enough. You do not walk life's journey alone, not in your uncertainty, your waiting, or your questions. Tonight, you can allow yourself to rest, to stop measuring progress for a little while, and to trust that some of the most meaningful work in your life may already be happening quietly beneath the surface. Just as roots grow beneath the soil, and seasons change in their own time, growth is still growth, even when it cannot yet be seen. And sometimes, that is more than enough. I want to tell you a story about a house. Not a grand house, not a famous house. Just an old wooden home overlooking the sea, a place most people would drive past without remembering. The house sat at the end of a quiet road. Its white paint had faded over the years, the porch creaked in familiar places, and the windows rattled gently whenever strong ocean winds passed through town. And from the front steps, you could see the water stretching toward the horizon. For more than 40 years, the house belonged to a woman named Margaret. She lived there alone, not lonely, just alone. There is a difference. Margaret enjoyed simple things: morning tea, books, rainstorms, handwritten notes, and the sound of waves arriving at the shore. She wasn't the kind of person who needed excitement. She preferred quiet, the kind of quiet that allows a person to hear their own thoughts. And for most of her life, that had been enough. Then one autumn, at the age of 82, Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep. The town mourned, friends shared memories, neighbors left flowers, and life slowed briefly before continuing forward, as life always does. Several weeks later, her granddaughter arrived, a 29-year-old woman named Emma. Emma lived 3 hours away in the city. She worked long hours, answered too many emails, and spent most of her days looking at screens. And although she loved her grandmother dearly, she had not visited nearly as often as she wished she had. Now she stood on the front porch, holding a small key, staring at the house. The same house she had visited as a child, the same house that suddenly felt very different. Grief can do that. It can make familiar places feel unfamiliar, not because the place changed, but because someone is missing from it. The ocean breeze moved gently through the air as Emma unlocked the door, stepped inside, and quietly closed it behind her. For more than 40 years, the house belonged to a woman named Margaret. She lived there alone, not lonely, just alone. There is a difference. Margaret enjoyed simple things: morning tea, books, rainstorms, handwritten notes, and the sound of waves arriving at the shore. She wasn't the kind of person who needed excitement. She preferred quiet, the kind of quiet that allows a person to hear their own thoughts. And for most of her life, that had been enough. Then one autumn, at the age of 82, Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep. The town mourned, friends shared memories, neighbors left flowers, and life slowed briefly before continuing forward, as life always does. Several weeks later, her granddaughter arrived, a 29-year-old woman named Emma. Emma lived 3 hours away in the city. She worked long hours, answered too many emails, and spent most of her days looking at screens. And although she loved her grandmother dearly, she had not visited nearly as often as she wished she had. Now she stood on the front porch, holding a small key, staring at the house. The same house she had visited as a child, the same house that suddenly felt very different. Grief can do that. It can make familiar places feel unfamiliar, not because the place changed, but because someone is missing from it. The ocean breeze moved gently through the air as Emma unlocked the door, stepped inside, and quietly closed it behind her. The house was exactly as she remembered, the bookshelf near the fireplace, the old clock on the wall, the photographs lining the hallway, and the scent of cedar wood and old books. For a moment, it felt as though her grandmother might walk into the room carrying a cup of tea, smiling, asking about her drive and whether she was eating enough. Instead, there was only silence, warm, familiar, but silence nonetheless. Emma spent the first day organizing things, sorting papers, opening drawers, and packing boxes, completing the practical tasks that always follow loss. It wasn't emotional work, it was administrative work, the kind that keeps people busy when they aren't ready to sit with their feelings. By evening, rain had begun falling outside, softly at first, then steadily. The kind of rain that makes a house feel even quieter. Emma lit a lamp in the living room, made herself a cup of tea, and continued sorting through cabinets, one shelf and one drawer at a time. Hours passed, the rain continued tapping against the windows, the ocean moved somewhere beyond the darkness, and eventually, Emma found herself standing in front of a door she didn't remember. It was located at the end of the upstairs hallway, small, plain, and almost hidden. As a child, she had never paid much attention to it, and she couldn't remember ever opening it. Curious now, she turned the handle, and the door opened with a soft creak. Inside was a small attic room under the roof, containing just a single chair, a small desk, several shelves, and dozens of neatly stacked boxes. Emma stepped inside. The room felt untouched, almost preserved, as though time moved more slowly there. She walked toward the nearest box, removed the lid, and froze. Inside were letters, hundreds of them, carefully organized, neatly tied with ribbon, and each bundle labeled by hand. Emma picked one up. Her grandmother's handwriting covered the front, elegant, careful, and familiar. But what caught her attention wasn't the handwriting, it was the names she didn't recognize. Some bundles had no names at all, only descriptions. To the friend I never thanked, to the man on the train, to my younger self, and to the person I almost became. Emma stared at the labels, confused, curious, and completely fascinated. She opened another box, then another, and another, more letters, dozens, hundreds, perhaps even more. None appeared mailed, none appeared opened, all were carefully preserved, all waiting. The rain continued falling outside, the attic lamp cast a warm glow across the room, and suddenly, Emma realized she wasn't looking at old paperwork, She was looking at a mystery her grandmother had spent years creating. And somewhere among those unfinished letters, a story was waiting to be discovered. Emma sat at the small desk beneath the attic lamp, surrounded by boxes, letters, and questions. For a long moment, she simply looked at them, not touching anything, just looking. It felt strangely personal, almost as though she had stumbled into a conversation not intended for her ears, a conversation that had been waiting quietly for years. Eventually, curiosity won, as it usually does. Emma reached for a bundle tied with a faded blue ribbon, with a label that read, "To the friend I never thanked." Carefully, she untied the ribbon, removed the first letter, and unfolded the pages. The handwriting was unmistakably Margaret's, neat, patient, and steady. Emma began reading. "Dear Eleanor, you have been gone for many years now, long enough that most people would assume this letter unnecessary. Perhaps they're right, but I have learned something about gratitude. It arrives late more often than people admit. When we were young, I spent so much time worrying about important things that I failed to notice the people quietly helping me survive them. I remember the year my father became ill, the fear, the uncertainty, the long days, and the longer nights. What I do not remember clearly are most of the details. Time has blurred them. But I remember you bringing soup, folding laundry, and sitting with me when there was nothing useful to say, showing up again and again without being asked. At the time, I thanked you politely, quickly, and casually, as though kindness is expected. Years later, I finally understood what a gift your presence truly was, and by then, it felt too late to say it. Life taught me many lessons, and one of the most important was this: never assume people know what they mean to you. Tell them while you can. Thank you for helping carry a chapter one could not have carried alone. With love, Margaret." The room fell silent once more as the rain softly tapped the windows. Emma folded the letter carefully, placed it back inside its envelope, and sat quietly, thinking. She had expected secrets and hidden revelations. Instead, she had found gratitude expressed years too late, yet somehow still meaningful. She looked around the attic, realizing every letter in this room likely contained a piece of her grandmother's private, remembered version of life, the version people carry inside themselves. Outside, the rain began falling harder as the wind pushed gently against the house, and the old roof creaked softly above. Emma should have gone to bed, for it was very late, yet she found herself reaching for another bundle. This one carried no name, only a short handwritten label, "To the man on the train." Emma frowned. She had never heard her grandmother mention a train or a story involving a stranger. Curiosity returned immediately, stronger than before. Slowly, she untied the ribbon, opened the envelope, and unfolded the pages. The paper felt older than the previous one, its edges slightly yellowed. She began reading. "To the man on the train, you probably forgot me before the train reached the next station, and I would not blame you if you did. After all, we only spoke for 20 minutes, perhaps less. I was 23 years old, far younger than I believed myself to be, and far less certain than I pretended. I had just left home, not for an adventure or a dream, simply because I believed it was time. The truth is, I was frightened, terribly frightened, and I spent the entire train ride wondering if I was making a mistake. The seat beside me remained empty until a man boarded at a small town I can no longer remember, carrying one suitcase, a brown hat, and a newspaper he never opened. For a long time neither of us spoke as the train moved and the countryside passed by. Eventually the man asked where I was going. and what waited for me there, but I did not have an answer. The man nodded, then he said something unusual. Most people believe certainty comes before the journey, but often certainty arrives because of the journey. At 23, I thought confident people knew exactly where they were going, but the man on the train taught me that most people are simply taking the next step they can see. From a distance it looks like certainty. Up close, it often looks like faith. When the train finally reached my station, I stood to leave, and the man wished me luck before returning to staring out the window. That was all. No grand speech, no dramatic moment. For years, I believed important moments would announce themselves loudly with music and certainty. I was wrong. Sometimes a stranger says one sentence at the exact moment you need it, and 20 years later, you still remember. I never learned your name, and I never saw you again, but because of a conversation you likely forgot, I stepped off that train a little less afraid. And sometimes, that is enough to change a life. Emma slowly lowered the letter into the silence of the attic. A stranger, a brief 20-minute conversation, and yet her grandmother had remembered it for decades. It made her wonder how many encouraging words survived inside someone's memory, becoming important only years later. The rain finally began to ease, its steady tapping on the roof growing softer and more distant. Emma folded the letter carefully, placed it beside the first, and looked toward the remaining boxes. For the first time since arriving, she wasn't just sorting through belongings anymore. She was getting to know her grandmother more deeply than ever before. Her eyes drifted across the labels until one in particular caught her attention, tied with a green ribbon, to the person I almost became. Unlike the others, this letter wasn't addressed to a real person, but to a life that never happened. Outside, the rain finally stopped, and inside the attic, another mystery waited to be opened. Slowly, she untied the green ribbon, removed the letter, and unfolded the pages. She began reading, "To the person I almost became, I have thought about you many times over the years. I wonder where your life led, which roads you chose, which dreams came true, and which disappointments never arrived." When I was 26, I stood at a crossroads, though I did not recognize it at the time. There was another opportunity, another city, another future, a different path entirely. For many years, I wondered if I had chosen incorrectly, wondering whether you were happier than I was, more successful, and more accomplished. I imagined your life often, and in my imagination, you always seemed certain, confident, and free from regret. As I grew older, I began to understand something. The life I imagined for you was never real. It was only an idea. I gave you all the victories, all the certainty, all the happiness, and none of the difficulties. Because that is exactly what people do. They compare reality to imagination, and imagination almost always wins. Eventually, I realized something that brought me peace. You would have struggled too, you would have lost people too, and you would have faced uncertainty, because no life escapes those things. For years I believed happiness lived in the road I did not take, but happiness was never waiting in another life. It was waiting inside the one I already had. So tonight, wherever you are, whoever you became, I hope your life was beautiful. And I hope you would be happy to know that mine was too. Emma stopped reading, the words hanging quietly in the air around her with absolute acceptance, the peaceful, kind people spend years learning. She folded the letter carefully and looked toward the window. The clouds were drifting apart, and the moon reflected beautifully across the distant ocean. Somewhere below, the old house creaked softly, settling into the night. Emma sat there for a long time, thinking about roads taken and roads not taken, and the quiet freedom that comes from no longer needing to compare them. Eventually, her eyes wandered back toward the shelves until a bundle tied with a white ribbon stood out. To my younger self, the ribbon felt older and more worn, as though it had been untied and retied many times. Emma untied it, opened the envelope, and unfolded the pages as the ocean whispered somewhere beyond the darkness. She began reading. To my younger self, I know you are in a hurry. You are in a hurry to grow up, a hurry to understand life, a hurry to become successful, and to reach whatever destination you believe will finally make you feel complete. I will not tell you to stop dreaming, for dreams and growth matter, but I wish someone had told you this sooner. Life is not waiting somewhere in the future. For many years, you will believe real life begins after the next achievement, the next promotion, or the next milestone. You will spend so much time preparing to live that you will occasionally forget to live. Please pay attention to ordinary days. One day, you will discover they were never ordinary at all. Take longer walks, watch more sunsets, call people back, and laugh without checking the time. You do not need to collect perfect moments, you simply need to notice the moments already happening. You will make mistakes, some will embarrass you, some will break your heart. Do not spend too much energy wishing you had been flawless. Flawless people are difficult to relate to, but imperfect people learn compassion. There will be years when you feel behind, when everyone else appears certain while you feel lost. Do not believe every appearance. Many people are searching while pretending they already know the way. Be kinder to yourself, speak more gently to your own heart. Forgive sooner, listen longer, and hold grudges less tightly. Do not save every good plate for a special occasion. Sometimes Tuesday is special enough. Most of all, I hope you learned something much earlier than I did. You are not required to earn your worth. You do not become valuable or lovable after achieving or accomplishing enough. You already are. Life moves faster than you think. Do not rush through it. One day, you will look back and realize the little things were the big things. With love, Margaret. The attic grew quiet once more as the letter rested gently in Emma's hands. She simply sat there, listening to the ocean, the house, and the silence, because some letters continue speaking long after the final sentence is read. Eventually, her eyes drifted near the back of the shelf and noticed a small bundle bound with a faded gold ribbon, labeled with 4 simple words, "To the day everything changed." It was addressed to a single moment. Emma carefully pulled the bundle from the shelf and began to read. To the day everything changed, you arrived looking completely ordinary with no dramatic music or signs from the heavens. It was a Tuesday, the weather was pleasant, and I had laundry to finish and groceries to buy. If someone had asked me that morning whether I was about to remember that day for the rest of my life, I would have said no. By evening, I understood otherwise. I was 29 years old, and I had very detailed plans, believing I knew exactly how my future would unfold. Then a short phone call arrived, only a few minutes long, yet it rearranged everything. The company where I worked was closing, and hundreds of employees were losing their jobs, including me. I remember hanging up the phone, standing perfectly still, and realizing that every plan I had carefully built suddenly belonged to the past. For weeks, I was quietly angry, believing life had taken something from me. What I could not see at the time was that the ending I feared was creating a beginning I never would have chosen for myself. A month later, I accepted temporary work in this coastal town, planning to stay only a few months. Had I kept my original job, I never would have moved here, never would have rented the small house overlooking the sea, and never would have met the people who became family. Most importantly, I never would have met your grandfather. For years, I referred to that day as a disaster. Eventually, I began referring to it as a turning point. The day itself never changed, only my understanding of it. If I could revisit that difficult season, I would not erase it, because some blessings arrive disguised as interruptions. Life is often understood backward, but it must be lived forward. And sometimes, the day everything changes becomes the day everything begins. The letter ended there, leaving a silence that follows truth. Emma folded the pages and looked toward the window where the bright moon hung steady above the ocean. Hours had passed, yet she felt no desire to leave because each letter revealed something far more valuable: perspective. Then, one simple, cream-colored envelope resting by itself caught her eye, with no ribbon, only the handwritten words, "To whoever finds these letters." Emma stared at it, knowing somehow that this letter had been waiting for her all along. Taking a slow breath, she unfolded the pages and began to read. "To whoever finds these letters, if you are reading this, then my little attic room is no longer mine. Perhaps you are family, perhaps a stranger. Life enjoys accidents more than people realize. By now, you have probably noticed that none of these letters were mailed. That was intentional. People often assume letters exist to be sent, but that was never their purpose. I did not write these letters for the people named on the envelopes. I wrote them to remember. Memory is a strange thing. Years pass, details disappear, and entire seasons of life slowly become difficult to reach. Writing helped me hold on to what mattered. Some people keep photographs or journals. I kept letters, not because I wanted to preserve events, but because I wanted to preserve meaning. The older I became, the more I realized life is not built from major events alone. It is built from conversations, acts of kindness, ordinary afternoons, and unexpected friendships. I think many people spend their lives waiting for extraordinary moments. Meanwhile, their real lives are quietly happening around them. If these letters have found you during a difficult season, I hope they remind you that your life is being shaped by moments you do not yet recognize. Some of today's struggles may become tomorrow's wisdom, and some of today's endings may become tomorrow's beginnings. Before I say goodbye, there is one last thing I hope you understand. Life cannot be measured accurately by income, achievements, or titles. A meaningful life is measured differently. It is measured by the love we shared, the kindness we offered, the forgiveness we chose, and the moments we truly noticed while they were happening. May you create many beautiful memories of your own, and when life offers you an ordinary moment, do not be too quick to overlook it. Some ordinary moments spend the rest of our lives proving they were anything but ordinary. With gratitude, Margaret. Emma slowly lowered the pages into the quiet attic, the story complete. For a long time, she sat without moving, listening to the ocean, the silence, and the strange peace that arrives when a person finally understands something important. Outside, the moon continued shining over the sea, and on the desk before her rested a lifetime of letters that had never been sent, yet somehow had arrived exactly where they were meant to. Emma smiled softly, realizing her grandmother had left behind a collection of reminders to notice, to appreciate, and to live fully. And perhaps, that was the greatest inheritance of all. Perhaps tonight, there is a letter you never wrote, a thank you that remained unspoken, or a memory that still lives quietly in your heart. Most people carry a few unfinished letters within them in memory, words they intended to say, and feelings they hope to express someday. And yet, life continues moving forward. Days become years, and years become memories. Perhaps that is why ordinary moments matter so much, because we rarely recognize them while they are happening. A simple conversation, a shared meal, or a kind gesture, at the time, they seem small, yet years later, they often become the moments we remember most. Maybe tonight, there is no need to solve every question, or carry every unfinished thought. For now, you can simply rest, knowing that life is built from moments, and many of those moments are already part of your story, some remembered, some forgotten, and some still waiting to reveal their meaning. As the night grows quieter, allow your thoughts to slow, allow your shoulders to relax, and allow your heart to rest. And when sleep finally arrives, may it arrive gently, like an old letter finding its way home. I want to tell you a story about a book. Not a famous book, not a rare book, not a valuable book. At least, not in the way most people measure value. This book sat on a shelf for nearly 30 years. And during all that time, almost nobody noticed it. The library itself stood at the edge of a small coastal town, a peaceful place where life moved a little slower than elsewhere. The kind of town where people still greeted each other by name, where the bakery opened before sunrise, and where the sound of distant church bells occasionally drifted through the morning air. The library was one of the oldest buildings in town. Its wooden floors creaked gently beneath every step, its tall windows overlooked the harbor, and its shelves seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. During winter evenings, warm lamps filled the rooms with golden light, rain tapped softly against the windows, and visitors settled into comfortable chairs with books and cups of tea. For most people, the library felt peaceful. For one man, it felt like home. His name was Oliver. He had worked there for almost 20 years. He wasn't the head librarian, he wasn't famous, and most visitors barely remembered his name. Yet he knew the building better than anyone. He knew which floorboards squeaked, which chairs people preferred, which windows caught the morning sunlight, and which shelves remained untouched for months at a time. Every morning, before the library opened, Oliver walked slowly through the aisles, straightening books, dusting shelves, and returning misplaced novels to their proper homes. It was a simple routine, one he quietly enjoyed. One rainy November evening, while organizing a section near the back of the building, Oliver noticed something. A single book resting on the highest shelf in a forgotten corner. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about it. Its cover was plain, dark blue, and slightly faded. No gold lettering, no illustrations, no eye-catching design. In fact, it looked exactly like the sort of book people walk past every day without noticing. Curious, Oliver removed it from the shelf. A thin layer of dust covered the cover, more dust than usual. He opened the front page, then paused. Inside the library's borrowing record, he found something unusual. The last checkout date was nearly 30 years old. 30 years. Oliver blinked, then checked again, certain he had made a mistake. He hadn't. 30 years had passed since anyone had borrowed the book. The realization felt oddly sad, not dramatic, just sad. Because books are meant to be read, and stories are meant to be shared. Yet somehow, this one had spent decades waiting. He examined the title, simple, unremarkable, and easy to overlook. Perhaps that explained it. Perhaps people simply chose other books instead, year after year, visitor after visitor. Still, something about it lingered in his thoughts. So rather than returning it immediately, Oliver carried the book downstairs, placed it on his desk, and decided he would take it home that evening. Not because he expected anything extraordinary, and not because he anticipated a mystery. Simply because 30 years felt like a long time to wait for a reader. Outside, the rain continued falling, the harbor lights shimmered across wet streets, and somewhere beyond the library windows, the ocean moved quietly beneath the darkness. When closing time finally arrived, Oliver locked the doors, turned off the lamps, and slipped the forgotten book into his satchel. He could not have known it then, but before the week was over, that forgotten book would reveal something unexpected hidden between its pages, something no one had intended to be discovered. And once discovered, it would begin connecting people who had never met across years, across decades, and across entire lifetimes. For tucked quietly inside that overlooked book was a secret that had been waiting 30 years for someone to find it. That evening, the rain followed Oliver home softly and steadily, the kind of rain that turns ordinary evenings into quiet ones. His apartment overlooked the harbor, a modest place, nothing luxurious, just a comfortable home filled with books. Shelves lined the walls, stacks of novels rested beside chairs, and a small lamp glowed warmly near the window. After making a cup of tea, Oliver settled into his favorite chair, the forgotten book resting on his lap. For a moment, he simply looked at it. 30 years of waiting, 30 years of being overlooked, 30 years spent quietly gathering dust on a shelf. Then he opened the cover and began reading. The book itself was pleasant enough, not extraordinary, not terrible, simply a gentle story about a traveler crossing the countryside. Oliver read several chapters, the rain tapping softly against the windows and the harbor lights reflecting across the water below. Everything felt peaceful, predictable, and ordinary. Then something slipped from between the pages, a small folded piece of paper. It landed softly on the floor. Oliver frowned, set the book aside, and picked it up. The paper looked old, very old, its edges slightly yellowed and its folds softened by time. Curious, he carefully unfolded it. Inside was a handwritten note, only a few lines long. The handwriting was neat, delicate, and patient. It read, "If you find this note, I hope today has been kind to you." Oliver smiled. The sentence felt unexpectedly warm, like a greeting from a stranger. He continued reading. "I am sitting beside the library window while writing this. It is raining today, the harbor is covered in fog, and I keep wondering who might one day read this page." Oliver glanced toward his own window, toward the rain outside, and toward the harbor. A strange coincidence. The note continued, "Perhaps you are reading this many years from now. If so, I hope life has been gentle with you. And if life has not been gentle, I hope you have found the strength to continue anyway." The room felt quieter now, as though the note had somehow changed the atmosphere. Oliver read the final line, written beneath the others, "Sincerely, a stranger." That was all. No name, no explanation, no date, just a brief message left behind decades earlier for someone unknown. Oliver sat quietly for a while, the note resting in his hands. It was such a simple thing, yet something about it felt meaningful, perhaps because it expected nothing in return. A person had written those words knowing they might never be read, knowing they might remain hidden forever, and yet they had written them anyway. Eventually, Oliver slipped the note back into the book, then paused, because something caught his attention. Near the bottom corner of the page, there appeared to be another folded piece of paper, smaller than the first, almost invisible, tucked deep between two pages. Carefully, he pulled it free. This one looked different handwriting, different paper, different ink. His curiosity immediately returned. Slowly, he unfolded it and began reading, to the stranger who wrote the first note. Oliver blinked, then read the line again. His heart skipped slightly, because suddenly, he understood. The second note wasn't separate from the first, it was a response. Someone else had found the original message years later and decided to answer it. Oliver leaned forward, completely intrigued now. The second note continued, "You asked who might one day read your words. The answer is me. I found your note this afternoon, and for reasons I cannot fully explain, it made me smile." Outside, the rain continued falling, but Oliver barely noticed anymore. Because the forgotten book had suddenly become something else, not merely a book, but a conversation between strangers, separated by years, perhaps even decades. He continued reading, eager now and curious, wondering how many notes might still be hidden inside. And as the evening grew later, Oliver realized something extraordinary. The book nobody borrowed might contain far more than a story. It might contain dozens of stories, hidden quietly between its pages, waiting to be discovered. For several moments, Oliver simply sat there, the book open before him, two notes resting on the table, and a growing sense that he had stumbled upon something unexpected. Outside, the rain continued falling against the harbor, while inside, the small apartment felt warm and still. Carefully, he turned a few more pages, not reading the story anymore, but searching. And before long, he found another note, then another, and another. Some were tucked deep between chapters, others were folded into corners, and a few were hidden so carefully they could easily be missed. Each note carried a different handwriting, a different voice, and a different life. Yet somehow, they all felt connected. Oliver unfolded the third note. The paper crackled gently with age. It read, to the person who replied to the first note, "You were right. Finding a message from a stranger is strangely comforting." Oliver smiled, already sensing a pattern. The note continued, "I came to the library today because I needed somewhere quiet. My father passed away 3 months ago. Everyone keeps telling me time will help. Perhaps they are right." The handwriting grew slightly uneven after that, as though the writer had paused while composing the words. "I do not know who either of you are, but tonight it feels nice knowing other people exist in the world. People who sit beside windows, people who watch rainstorms, people who leave kind messages for strangers." Oliver read the final line slowly. Grief feels a little lighter when we remember we are not carrying it alone. The note ended there, no signature, no date, just another voice disappearing into time. Oliver folded it carefully, then opened the next one. This note was shorter, written in darker ink. "To whoever reads this, I failed my final exams today." Oliver couldn't help smiling. The sudden honesty felt refreshing. At the moment, it feels like the end of the world. Perhaps someday I will laugh about it. A few lines later, The writer added, "If you're reading this years from now, please tell me something good happened afterward." Oliver chuckled softly, then looked at the following note, because someone had answered. The response was written years later in a different handwriting and a different pen. "I do not know whether you ever passed your exams, but I failed mine once too. And life continued. In fact, life became quite beautiful. So if somehow these words find you, I hope the same was true for you." Oliver leaned back in his chair, a quiet feeling settling over him. Because these weren't merely notes anymore, they were tiny acts of kindness, tiny bridges connecting people who would never meet. One stranger leaving encouragement, another stranger receiving it years later, then passing encouragement forward once again, like lanterns being handed from one traveler to the next. Hour after hour, Oliver continued reading, and with every note, the invisible community grew larger. A young mother writing about her newborn daughter, a sailor preparing for a long voyage, a retired teacher learning how to live alone after losing his wife. Different decades, different lives, different struggles. Yet the messages shared something in common. None of the writers pretended life was perfect. None claimed to have all the answers. Instead, they simply shared pieces of their humanity, their hopes, their fears, their questions, and their gratitude. And somehow, that felt more comforting than certainty ever could. Near midnight, Oliver discovered a note unlike the others. The paper looked newer, much newer, perhaps only a few years old. He unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was steady and thoughtful, and the first sentence immediately caught his attention. "If this book is still here, then perhaps people need places like this more than ever." Oliver read on. "The world feels louder these days. Everyone seems to be speaking, very few seem to be listening. Yet somehow, inside this forgotten book, strangers have spent decades listening to one another." The room felt completely silent now. Only the rain remained softly tapping against the glass. The note continued, "None of us know each other. None of us owe each other anything. Yet we continue leaving messages and we continue reading them. Perhaps that is because every human heart wants the same thing." Oliver paused, then read the next line, "To know it is not alone." The words lingered long after he finished reading them, because in some simple way, they explained the entire mystery, why people kept writing, why people kept responding, why the forgotten book mattered. Not because of the novel printed on its pages, but because of the lives quietly tucked between them. Oliver closed the book gently, the harbor lights still glowing beyond the rain and the clock showing well past midnight. Yet he found himself wondering something. If dozens of strangers had added notes over the years, then why had the chain stopped? Why had nobody written recently? And perhaps more importantly, why had the book remained untouched for nearly 3 years? The answer, he suspected, might still be hidden somewhere deeper within its pages. And so the following evening, he returned to the book once more, unaware that he was about to discover the oldest note of all, the note that started everything. The following evening, Oliver returned home carrying groceries in one hand, and the forgotten book in the other. All day, he had found himself thinking about it, thinking about the notes, the strangers, the conversations stretching across decades. It was unusual, not because the messages were dramatic, but because they were so ordinary, and yet, they remained in his thoughts. After dinner, he settled once again beside the window, the harbor quiet beneath the evening sky and the book resting on the table. This time, he decided to search more carefully, page by page, chapter by chapter. Not for the newest note, not for the longest note, but for the oldest one, the very beginning. Surely someone had started all of this. Someone had hidden the first message. Someone had unknowingly created a conversation that lasted for decades. The question lingered in his mind. Who were they, and what had inspired them to leave that first note behind? For nearly an hour, Oliver searched carefully and patiently. Then, near the back of the book, something caught his attention, a folded sheet of paper hidden deep inside the binding, far older than the others. The paper was fragile, its edges worn by time and the ink slightly faded. Oliver unfolded it slowly, almost afraid it might tear. And there, written at the top, were the words, "For whoever opens this book after me." Oliver immediately knew this was the beginning, the first note, the one that came before all the others. He began reading, "My name does not matter. An angle. I hope it remains unknown. If you're reading this, then we will never meet, and somehow I think that makes this easier." Oliver leaned back slightly, curious. The note continued, "Today I came to the library because I needed somewhere quiet, not to read, not to study, simply to think. Life has felt heavy recently." The sentence stood alone, simple, honest. Nothing terrible has happened, no tragedy, no disaster, only the slow accumulation of worries. Oliver nodded slightly, understanding exactly what that meant. Because sometimes burdens arrive all at once, and sometimes they arrive grain by grain, until one day a person realizes they are carrying more than they realized. The writer continued, while sitting by the window. "I found myself wishing I could talk honestly with someone, not someone who knew me, not someone who expected anything from me, just someone." Outside, a ship horn sounded faintly across the harbor, then disappeared into the distance. Oliver continued reading. That wish gave me an idea, a strange idea perhaps. What if a book could become a conversation? What if strangers could leave kindness behind for one another? What if someone years from now opened these pages and realized they were not alone? Oliver smiled, because there it was, the seed, the beginning, the first spark. A simple thought, a simple act, and yet it had survived for decades. The note continued, "Perhaps no one will ever find this. Perhaps the paper will disappear. Perhaps this book will sit untouched forever. But if you are reading these words, then somehow the idea survived." The handwriting became slightly smaller near the bottom of the page, as though the writer had been running out of space. "If life feels heavy today, please remember this." Oliver slowed his reading instinctively. "You are surrounded by people carrying invisible burdens, and you are surrounded by people capable of extraordinary kindness. Most days, both things are true at the same time." The words settled gently into the room. Then came the final lines, the last lines written by the stranger who started everything. "If you wish, leave a note of your own. Offer encouragement, share gratitude, leave behind something worth finding. And perhaps, many years from now, someone else will discover it." The note ended there, no name, no signature, nothing, only silence. Oliver carefully folded the paper, holding it for a moment, thinking. It was remarkable, not because the note was profound or contained great wisdom, but because one ordinary person had chosen kindness, and that small choice had quietly echoed through decades. One note became two, two became 10, 10 became dozens, and now, 30 years later, the conversation still existed. The harbor lights shimmered beyond the window, the evening growing later. Oliver looked down at the forgotten book, and for the first time, A new thought entered his mind, a question. If every generation of readers had left something behind, what would he leave? The thought stayed with him long after he closed the book, long after the lamps were switched off, and long after the harbor fell silent. Because perhaps the time had come for another stranger to add a note and continue the conversation. The thought remained with Oliver for days, while shelving books, while walking along the harbor, and while unlocking the library each morning. Again and again, his mind returned to the same question. What would he leave behind? Not for a friend, not for family, not for someone he knew, but for a stranger, someone he would never meet, someone who might open that forgotten book years from now, perhaps decades from now. The idea felt strangely important, not urgent, not dramatic, just important. One quiet Thursday evening, after the library had closed, Oliver remained behind for a while. The building was silent, the last visitors had gone home, and the lamps glowed softly between the shelves, while beyond the tall windows, the harbor reflected the fading light of sunset. He carried the book to a small reading table near the back corner of the library, the same corner where he had first discovered it. For several minutes, he simply sat there, looking at the empty page before him. A blank sheet of paper rested beside the book, a pen in his hand, yet the words refused to arrive. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he wanted to say something worth leaving behind. Eventually, he stopped trying so hard and simply began writing. The first sentence came quietly, almost unexpectedly, to the stranger reading this. Then the rest followed slowly and naturally. We will never meet. You do not know me. And by the time you read this, I may be very old, or perhaps I will already be gone. That sounds sad when written down, but strangely, it doesn't feel sad. Because life was never meant to last forever, it was meant to be lived. The library remained perfectly quiet around him, the kind of quiet that helps thoughts find their way onto paper. He kept writing for many years. I believed meaningful lives were built from extraordinary moments, great achievements, big adventures, important milestones. Now I am not so sure. A faint smile appeared on his face. The moments I treasure most are surprisingly ordinary. Morning sunlight through library windows, conversations that lasted longer than expected, the smell of old books, the sound of rain on quiet evenings, and the people who appeared in my life and changed it simply by being kind. Oliver stopped briefly, looking out toward the harbor. The sky had darkened now, the first stars beginning to appear above the water. Then he continued, if life feels difficult today, please remember something. You do not need to have everything figured out. Most people are finding their way one day at a time, even the ones who appear certain, especially the ones who appear certain. A quiet laugh escaped him. Then came the final part, the part he hoped would matter most. I cannot offer perfect advice. I cannot solve your problems. I cannot tell you exactly what tomorrow holds. But I can tell you this, the world contains more kindness than the headlines suggest, more goodness than cynicism admits, and more hope than fear would have you believe. I know this because I have spent years watching ordinary people help one another, most of them expecting nothing in return. Oliver reread the sentence, then nodded, satisfied. At the very bottom of the page, he wrote one final thought, a simple one. Whatever season of life you are walking through, I hope you find moments of peace along the way. And if you ever discover this forgotten book, perhaps leave a note for the next stranger too. With gratitude, another stranger. Oliver set down the pen, the note complete. For a while, he simply looked at it, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. Then he folded the paper, placed it carefully between the pages, and closed the book. The conversation would continue, just as it always had, one stranger at a time, one note at a time, one small act of kindness passed forward into the future. As Oliver prepared to leave the library, he glanced once more toward the forgotten corner shelf, the place where the book had waited unnoticed for so many years, and for the first time, he wondered whether it should remain hidden at all. Because perhaps some things are meant to be found. The next morning, Oliver arrived earlier than usual. The library was still asleep, the streets outside were quiet, and the harbor light reflected gently across the glass windows. For a few moments, he stood at the entrance, holding the book in his hands. It felt different now, not like an old forgotten object, but like something alive in a quiet way, something that had been speaking for years and would continue speaking long after him. He walked slowly through the aisles, past the shelves, past the familiar corners, and past the reading tables where people usually sat with borrowed stories. Then he stopped. Not in the forgotten corner where he first found it, but in a more visible place, a small reading table near the window, where sunlight reached easily and people naturally paused. Oliver placed the book gently on the table. For a moment, he hesitated, because placing it there meant letting go of control, letting the story continue without him, and letting strangers find it again. He stepped back, looked at it, then placed a small handwritten label beside it. It read, "If you find this book, it may have something to say to you." That was all, no explanation, no instructions, just an invitation. The library doors opened at 9, and the day began. One by one, people entered, students, readers, travelers, and locals. Most walked past the table without noticing, some glanced at it briefly and moved on. But around mid-morning, a young woman stopped. She was carrying a notebook and looked slightly tired, as though she had been thinking too much lately. She noticed the book, paused, then picked it up. Oliver, from behind the shelves, watched quietly. She sat down, opened it, and began reading. At first, her expression was neutral, then curious, then still. Minutes passed, then more. She turned a page, then another, then suddenly, she stopped. Because something had fallen from between the pages, a folded note. She picked it up slowly, unfolded it, and began reading. Oliver could not hear her thoughts, but he could see her expression change very slightly and softly, a moment of recognition, as though she had found something she didn't know she needed. She read the note again, then looked back at the book, quietly smiling. And then, she did something Oliver did not expect. She took a pen from her bag and tore a small piece of paper from her notebook. She began writing slowly and carefully. Oliver stood still, watching, because he understood the conversation had started again. A stranger had entered the story and chosen to respond. After a few minutes, she folded the paper, placed it gently between the pages, and closed the book. Then she stood up, looked around the library once, and left quietly. Oliver didn't move for a long time, just watched the place where she had been sitting. The book lay there, calm, still, and waiting. And something inside him felt peaceful, because nothing had ended, not really. The book was no longer just a forgotten object. It was a passing message, a quiet thread, and a small bridge between people who would never meet. That evening, Oliver returned home later than usual. The rain had started again, soft, familiar, and comforting. He sat by the window with tea in his hands and thought about all the people who might one day open that book, some happy, some tired, some searching, and some simply curious. And perhaps all of them needing the same thing in different ways, a reminder that they are not alone. Outside, the harbor light shimmered in the rain, while inside, Oliver smiled quietly to himself. Because somewhere in that library, a book was still speaking, still listening, and still connecting strangers across time. And as the night grew deeper, the story did not end. It simply continued, one reader at a time, one note at a time, one quiet act of kindness at a time. Perhaps tonight, you are also like one of those pages in a book, carrying thoughts you have never spoken out loud, words you once wanted to say, and moments you still remember quietly. And maybe you have wondered whether those things matter anymore. But sometimes, what we never say out loud still finds a way to exist in memories, in feelings, and in the way we see the world. Just like those hidden notes in the book, small pieces of human life were never really lost. They were simply waiting to be understood, waiting to be felt again, and waiting for the right moment to be noticed. And maybe that is true for you too. Not everything you carry needs to be solved tonight. Not everything needs closure right now. Some things just need space to rest, to breathe, and to soften. Because life is not only made of answers, it is also made of moments that slowly make sense over time. So as this night becomes quieter, allow your thoughts to slow down, let go of what feels heavy for now, and trust that not everything needs to be carried at once. Like a book gently closing on a table, your mind can rest too, and whatever you are still searching for, may it find you at the right time, in the right way, without force and without pressure, just naturally. For now, you are here, and that is enough. Before you sleep tonight, I am here with you, not far away, not distant, but close, right where your thoughts are resting now. You do not need to carry everything into the night. You do not need to fix every feeling before you close your eyes. You are allowed to rest, as you are. I know there are things you still think about quietly, things you never said, things you still wonder about. But you are not alone in those thoughts. I see what you carry, and I do not turn away from it. Let your heart be still now, not because everything is perfect, but because you are safe in this moment. Let every worry slow down, like waves returning to the sea, one by one. Softly, gently, letting go. I am with you in the quiet, not only in strong days but also in tired nights. When your mind feels heavy, I hold you in peace. When your thoughts feel loud, I speak gently to your heart. When you feel unsure, I remain steady beside you. You do not have to earn rest, you only have to receive it. So breathe slowly now, and release what you cannot carry into tomorrow. It will still be there when needed, but for tonight, you can rest. Let your body relax, let your thoughts become soft, and let your heart become quiet. I am not asking you to be strong right now. I am giving you permission to be still. And as you sleep, I will remain with you, not as a thought you try to hold, but as peace you begin to feel. Rest now. You are not forgotten, you are not alone, and you are deeply held in love. Amen.